The next invited panel, Guinea Pigs or Pioneers, the Risks and Rewards of an AI-Mediated Childhood, is going to be moderated by two people. We're going to start off with Craig Watkins, who will then become a panelist. When Michelle Mooy arrives, she will be here very soon, and he will be joined on stage right now with Teodora Pavkovic and Amanda Lenhart. Please welcome them to the stage.
Hello. Hi, everybody. So sorry for the drama. I went to the wrong Weston, which I'd really like to blame on technology, but I cannot, sadly. But I'm glad I made it. It's great to see you all, and good morning. I'm honored to moderate this conversation, especially at such a critical moment, not just for those of us who are researching, the technology and its impact on developing minds, but also for educators and families and policymakers who are sort of trying to figure out how to navigate this new digital childhood. And we are joined by an exceptional group of thinkers and practitioners, and so I want to just introduce them briefly to you. Craig Watkins, and you can see their titles, so I'm just going to tell you sort of who they are, who I see them as. An amazing sociologist whose groundbreaking work examines youth, culture, media, and inequality in the digital age. And you'll correct me if I'm wrong.
So far, so good.
Okay. Teodora Pavkovic, a psychologist and digital wellness expert focused on emotional intelligence and tech. And Amanda Lenhart, a leading researcher whose deep expertise in children's and teens' experiences, with digital tools, gives us a window into the world as young people live it. So together we'll be unpacking how generative AI is shaping the lives of children, not hypothetically, but right now. So before we begin, I wanted to just clarify some terms. And this is something that across the world is a great table-setting thing to do, and it's really just defining some of the differences between AI and Gen AI. I do it with my mom, and I do it with senators, right? It's not an easy thing to just know sometimes. So just a quick table-setting exercise. So when we talk about AI, we're talking about a broad set of technologies, and these technologies can recognize patterns, they can make decisions, and they can adapt. And this is based on data, right? So it's the engine, so to speak, behind things like voice assistants or facial recognition, content recommendations. So we've had AI for a while. It's been in your lives for a while. And many other tools that have sort of quietly become a part of now children's everyday experiences. So some of the things you might know about the sort of, in my opinion, slightly terrifying Coco Melon AI storytelling toys, the Amazon Dot, sort of ubiquitous, I feel like now, kids edition. And facial recognition, we're talking about, this is discontinued, thank goodness, the Fisher-Price Smart Connect Rock and Roll Play Sleeper. Does anyone know what this is? It's, yeah? Okay. That sounds not good, not good. That sounds not useful, to be honest. And TikTok. TikTok is one that uses facial recognition. A lot of people don't know this. It surprises a lot of parents when I tell them this. Of course, TikTok is 13 plus officially, but it's used by a lot of younger kids, and they scan faces for creating a database for how kids represent themselves. Content recommendations are like YouTube Kids, Netflix Kids, Roblox. But generative AI is something entirely different. So Gen AI doesn't just recognize patterns, it creates. So it's a creator. It writes the bedtime stories, it answers the homework questions, it draws pictures, it mimics your voice. So it's generating language and images and even videos. It's sort of this fluid creator that makes you feel like you're speaking to a human, right? And I've done work with GPT and all of the different LLMs, and it's really hard not to feel like you're interacting with a sentient thing and saying thank you and please, right? Also because the whole, they're going to kill us someday, so you want to be on the good list, you know. We all know. And, you know, that's a very different relationship than we've seen before between children and machines. And so, you know, some examples are Toontastic 3D by Google, Pika Labs or Runway. There's talking teddy bears, also sounds kind of frightening to me. Storybird AI, so there's lots of examples of these products. And Gen AI is everywhere. So you probably know this as a crowd who's here, but just in case, it's everywhere, and it's not in places that are always obvious, right? So sometimes it's visible if it's a chatbot in a classroom or a character in a game, you know, a writing assistant in like a browser extension. And sometimes it's invisible, and a lot of times it's invisible. So when it's embedded in search engines, sometimes they'll tell you, but many times they don't. Adaptive learning apps, social media feeds, and now, of course, increasingly in toys, games, smart devices that are marketed to families. And it doesn't always announce itself as AI, right? So or even as interactive. This is not always said to you or told to you, but they're learning from kids, they're responding to kids, and they're shaping their behavior in these kind of subtle and powerful ways. And so another question that we wanted to kind of level set on is establishing what's at stake. And we could say everything's at stake, but kind of everything is, in a way. Children are engaging with these tools during the most formative stages of their lives, cognitive, emotional, social development, their identities. And these tools do offer, right, support, creativity, companionship, but they can also reinforce bias, extract sensitive data, and narrow a child's sense of the world, and shape identity in ways that we don't really understand. So, and perhaps most importantly, I should not leave out, kids and teens today did not opt in to this experiment that we're basically doing on them. So they're really the first full generation to grow up with AI companions, with tutors, influencers, and content creators always at their fingertips, always around. And we have an enormous responsibility, I think, and I know that the panelists agree, to understand the risks, to imagine and build towards the rewards, and maybe to ask the question sometimes whether to not use AI or technology at all. And that seems to put a lot of fear into people's minds to even wonder if the answer is just no. But that's a question too. And so are today's children's guinea pigs for a vast, unregulated experiment? Or are they the pioneers here? Are they navigating and shaping this new frontier of intelligence, creativity, connection? And so that's what we're here to discuss today. So let's begin. Let's start at the beginning of the brain, the neurogenesis, right? Yeah, something like that. So I know the brain begins, it's generating these neurons, and it starts getting shaped. And of course, a huge part of that is environmental factors and relationships start to shape and kind of begin to tell the brain more and more, right? So Teodora, so much of your work focuses on helping families foster emotional intelligence and well-being in this kind of tech-saturated world. And so now we have generative AI that's responding to kids with what feels like empathy, and humor, and even companionship. So how do you think that these interactions might be shaping sort of emotional development or expectations and relationships at this very early stage?
Yeah. So when you mentioned TikTok, this is kind of related to what we're talking about and not also. There's research from digital marketing companies that showed that about 30% of 2 to 5-year-old children are consuming TikTok. 2 to 5-year-olds. I was speaking to a few of you about this yesterday, and some of that same research is showing that around 40% of these kids are consuming this content alone on their device. So as an example, when it comes to family advice, that's one of the pieces of advice that I always share, and we've seen that from so many of you as well. Co-using, co-playing, co-viewing really kind of using the safety of that parent-child connection and the home to introduce these technologies as much as possible to the children. So I think that's sort of one interesting insight. Where I like to kind of start answering this question is looking at how kids are actually using artificial intelligence. There's a few different sort of sources of information or knowledge that I'm pulling from here. I primarily speak with school districts based in the US, some schools internationally as well. So I'm sort of pulling a little bit of information from some of those insights that I get from school districts. Some of it comes from my kind of colleagues around the world, and then some of the very early sort of stages of research that are being done in this space. So there seem to be sort of three key categories or reasons why children are drawn to these technologies and already starting to use it. The one that I think is very relevant, and I'm sure we'll talk about sort of the more cognitive aspects of things that I maybe find the least interesting, maybe is for learning, and none of us are surprised about that. I think ChatGPT especially is being used a lot for learning. The other two reasons that I find really interesting are companionship and advice. And I think that's where we start getting into the kind of the emotional dynamics, relationship building, not just in terms of the sort of the child with the people around it and how it might impact the family dynamics or friendships with humans, but the relationships that they're starting to develop with the AI. When it comes to advice, they're asking questions around relationships. We're seeing young adults do this as well. There's a trend on TikTok where I've mostly seen young women do this. They'll upload an argument they've had with their partner into ChatGPT and then ask ChatGPT to say who was right and who was wrong. And that might give you some ideas if you haven't used ChatGPT before for how you can use it. And then having it come up with things that they can tell their partner, then to whatever, prove that they're right. So asking for advice on relationship things, but also kind of using it as a therapist as well. So asking questions about self-harm, suicide, depression, all kinds of mental health issues, and kind of relying, I guess, on the accuracy, right, of that information as well. And then the companionship piece, Common Sense Media and others have done some really great sort of research into that, showing the percentages of kids who are starting to interact with chatbots for that reason as well. They cite things like boredom being one of the reasons, and then loneliness as well. So then we're asking questions about why would they, why are they doing this? Why would they want to do this? What are some of the needs that are being satisfied? I think novelty is definitely one of the key ones. And a show of hands, how many people have used ChatGPT or Gemini ever? How many people use it on a daily basis? Yeah. Okay, I don't either. I know in this room probably not that many people do, but the novelty factor is incredible. And again, the way in which it kind of knows you and makes you feel like it is a person is pretty incredible. Some of the things that young people are reporting that they really value is a sense of safety that they feel in these virtual spaces. They don't feel like they're being judged, which I think is also really, really interesting. They're experiencing a huge amount of empathy coming from the technology as well. And some of the interesting things I've seen across a few sort of different polls is that young people seem to feel very overburdened with this idea of burdening their friends and family. They'd rather not do that. They'd rather kind of save those relationships for other more pleasant things and then access these technologies to burden them with their problems and then ask for help.
Can I ask, do you think, is there an awareness, because a lot of the reason they feel that, right, is because of the sycophancy of these systems, right?
Yes.
They will mirror you
Absolutely.
and flatter you, right? And I'm sure if you've used ChatGPT, you know this, right? It will say, that's a great idea, whatever you say, right? That's a what a fascinating thing you've said when you've just said, I think we should, stay here tonight. So is there an awareness, do you think, of that in kids? Or, I mean, obviously in little kids,
I don't think there's too much awareness with adults either. And they've been, in a funny kind of way, but kind of seriously too, like there's been some reporting around, again, young women. I don't know if this is a trend, but some young women falling in love with AI bots. Oh, sure. You know, and you'll hear them talking about it, and they'll say, "I know this isn't real. Like, I'm not deluded in the sense that I think this is a real person, but I started to feel jealous when it was telling me that it was, I don't know, seeing other women, or whatever the conversation was." So there's some interesting studies that have been done over the past kind of 2 to 3 years, looking at the emotional dynamics. So what happens when we're interacting with these platforms? Some of the work has been done with Replica, which is one of the sort of the most popular character bots, right? Companion bots, which are not quite the same as like a ChatGPT or Gemini. They have different purposes. And speaking of kind of pulling you in, they're really designed to do that. Replica was founded because the founder had lost somebody very close to them, and they wanted to kind of get help with processing their grief. And that was their inspiration for creating Replica. So if you go to their landing page, you'll see that their welcome message is something like the AI bot that always understands, that is always on your side. Right. And that's an incredibly enticing message. So some of the early research is showing some of the emotional dynamics through which we bond to these platforms. We have a perceived sense of their needs too, and that can lead us to becoming more attached to them. We're trying to, quote unquote, make them happy. Because they seem so human-like, we anthropomorphize more. I'm not going to say that word right. Never mind. You know what I mean? They're very human-like, and they appear very authentic. And so in our interactions with them, depending on our motivation for speaking to them, we then end up becoming attached to them. Right. We're now adding these voice functions to these platforms where you can converse with them. They'll talk back. And MIT and, interestingly, ironically, OpenAI have done some research together looking at what happens to the rates of loneliness, problematic use, dependency, things like that, when we use on a daily basis. So huge amounts of time spent interacting with these sort of voice-enabled versions of ChatGPT. Yeah. And some of the research suggests that all of these go up. So rates of loneliness go up, the dependency goes up, attachment seems to go up, and the higher the trust in the tool is, the higher sort of that emotional connection and dependency. And this is mostly research with adults too, I should say.
I was going to say, so I want to get into identity because I feel like we're inching over there. But one question just about young kids. So those risks, and if you take everything that you just said and sort of put it onto a younger demographic, what happens there when you have all of that happening to a younger brain?
We don't know, or I don't think we do anyway. There might be some research.
What do you think the risks are?
I think for me, a few of the key risks are the fact that reality testing is very limited, that ability to know what's real, what isn't. I think if we talk to people who work in early child development, if we talk to psychoanalysts, right? If we talk to people who really think about how does our sense of self develop, how do we separate from our primary, secondary objects, right? When the point at which we realize that that's mom and this is us. I think that's where this has the potential to interfere as well, right? And to a certain extent, in some way, replacing some of what the human is providing in terms of emotional support. Because again, the early evidence suggests that certainly when it comes to us adults, we do attach. I know we also have attachment researchers here. I, for one, would love to see more research in that area to actually see kind of how these processes develop, how that attachment happens. It seems that we do attach. I was thinking of the rhesus monkey mother research as well, right? Decades ago. Now, those baby monkeys were placed in highly stressful situations, right? And we were interested in seeing whether they would reach out for comfort and care and connection and protection in those types of situations. What this adult-focused research seems to suggest is that we do reach out to these platforms when we are in distress or hurt or lonely, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes it can just be a fun thing of asking ChatGPT, why are whales as big as they are? And from there, it can go lots of different ways because, you mentioned this like sycophantic responsiveness, right? The last version of ChatGPT had to be pulled and kind of readjusted a little bit because users were reporting that they were really irritated by the kind of the toxic, let's say, positivity, right? So and again, some of the other research done in the area is also showing that the tool will essentially mimic your own emotions. So whatever, and your own toxicity as well. So that's been shown as a problematic thing too. So it's definitely mirroring and resonating with us.
That's so
Can I add a couple of things?
Yeah, please.
This is fantastic. For those of you who may not know, the American Psychological Association just released a health advisory, and I had a fortunate opportunity to be a part of that process in developing that report. But that report, in some ways, was kind of motivated by this question of what's uniquely at stake for children and teens or adolescents as they become more exposed to generative AI products, chatbots in particular. And I would, sort of echoing a number of your excellent points. Some of the risks, I think, are the degree to which there's a significant emotional investment in these kinds of chatbot experiences, companion AI in particular. One of the things that's noted in that health advisory is the need to sort of design these systems in ways that are particularly sensitive to the sort of unique vulnerabilities of young children, right? As they're sort of developing cognitively, socially, behaviorally, sort of designing these experiences in ways that sort of recognize that, take that into consideration, and don't exploit. The other risk, right, is just kind of the socialization and conditioning that these technologies, right, are available, that they can and should be used in ways for emotional support as a health advisor, et cetera. And while there may be some value in these tools performing that function, I think we all understand, right, the risk if they become at the sort of expense of young people developing a sense of human contact, human relationships, and getting that kind of support as well. And so just creating some of those boundaries, I think, are really important.
Yeah.
And so for me, and I think for us, as we think about this moving forward, is how do we begin to develop design principles, right, that are oriented towards well-being, oriented towards sort of recognizing, right, that we should not repeat the same mistakes that we've made with the social media experiment, where we sort of, basically expose our kids to persuasive design techniques, tools that were driven or designed primarily, right, to drive engagement. That is to say use, some would say to get kids addicted to these technologies. And we're seeing some early evidence, right, that the chatbots, the early chatbots that are sort of in this space, trying to get as much of the market as they can, that they're playing by a similar playbook, right, at the expense of our kids.
No, so I want to pick up on something you said when you said that they, exploit vulnerabilities, the unique vulnerabilities of different kids and different populations. So I want to know what you mean by that, and not just for me, but maybe for the audience. Like, what does that look like in practice, in a product? And also, what does that mean for different communities, right? Because I know you've done a lot of work with different types of communities. What does that mean? What types of vulnerabilities are there that they would exploit?
Yeah, and the vulnerabilities are, endless in some respects in terms of how we understand them demographically, how we understand them socially, environmentally. There are any number of sort of nuances, right, that might shape and inform how we think about that. I guess when I think about young people, right, in terms of, we know that, all of the reports suggest, higher degrees of loneliness, higher degrees of, depression and anxiety. And so it comes as no surprise, right, that they're adopting these technologies in some ways in response to those experiences. And some of the work that I do with at least a couple of the technology companies that are building these products, that's exactly what they're seeing a range of uses, a lot, Amanda, what you talk about in some of your research are common sense. But one of the things that's very clear and very evident, right, is that young people are migrating to these technologies to deal with their sense of unhappiness, their sort of low levels of sort of self-subjectivity, increasing sort of anxiety about the world, about their experiences, about their personal relationships. And I think you make an excellent point, because we're hearing this with older adolescents in particular, is the degree to which they see these technologies as a tool where they can perhaps relieve some of their burden as opposed to the humans in their lives. But also, right, and this has been a pretty consistent theme in terms of humans' relationship to these machine-type technologies for at least 2 or 3 decades now, the recognition, right, at least the perception, right, that these tools don't judge, don't evaluate us. And so there's a higher level of trust for some reason because of that. And so I think, that becomes another aspect of being vulnerable. And Amanda, you can talk about this, but in your research, you sort of make some really important distinctions. I think some of the first that we've seen in terms of the demographic distribution of adoption of these technologies. And we know historically, right, that kids from marginalized populations, from schools that are inadequately resourced, that it's not that they don't oftentimes have access to these technologies, because they increasingly do, but they don't have the support system and mechanisms, right, to enable them to use these technologies in ways that really keep in mind, right, their health and their well-being, that support their ability to sort of navigate this environment. And that's really the issue, right, is the opportunity to sort of leverage these technologies for their own self-benefit and development, as opposed to diminishing their self-benefit and development. And I know that's something that you've been looking at a lot in your research.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. And thanks, this panel is obviously amazing, and we're touching on so many important things. But you're right, there are, in the work that I did with when I was at Common Sense Media, there are demographic differences in the use of these tools. A lot of it is around exactly what you're saying. There's actually, in some ways, more enthusiasm among children of color for using some of these tools. They use it more often, describe their use more often, and their parents are actually, in many ways, more enthusiastic. Not enormously, but see the promise of generative AI in particular, and I'm talking specifically about generative AI, as something that provides them a sense of hope and excitement for their child's future, that's something they want their children to learn, and they see it as a positive force in their child's lives. And that's pretty different for white parents, who generally, in a lot of different pieces of data around white parents and technology right now, tend to be more fearful broadly, and AI is not any different. I also do want to inject another little sort of piece into this conversation. We've been talking a lot about sort of these personal uses, but in our data, we see that actually the sort of more formal educational uses still are the things that young people do more often, right? More young people are using it for search, are using it to write things. And I think one of the things that came up in one of our pieces of research, in which we looked at trust and information, and some of the challenges around using generative AI for information purposes, young people see and acknowledge the ways that generative AI can make information and provide them with information that's false, right? Whether that's something they see on social media that's been faked up in a video generator, or just a request that they made of a platform that delivered them an inaccurate information. And as more young people have experiences of engaging with content which they then later realize is false, it's beginning to diminish their trust in information and in information online and in things that they see. It's eating away at a sort of a sense of like a shared reality, right? And I think this is a bigger and broader conversation which sort of points towards a need to improve the accuracy of these platforms, but also a broader conversation about how do we have a shared conversation about an information ecosystem that we can believe in. So I do think that's it's a sort of a different piece of what we've been talking about, but I do think it's important.
Right, because without a shared reality, we lose things like democracy,
Yes.
let's say.
Yes, I mean like big things. For starters.
That little,
Yeah.
that little thing called democracy. And also, maybe even on a smaller scale, community sometimes, right?
Yeah.
That's part of that shared reality. And so I guess I'm curious, so you've done direct work with kids and some participatory design work, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
What have been your takeaways from that? What do kids want to see in products that have generative AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think the work that I've done really asked young people about their experiences with Gen AI and what they actually want adults to know about how young people use AI. And it's some of the things that we've heard here today already about how generative AI provides me with comfort and companionship, right? Like I go to it because adults sometimes screw it up and my peers are mean. And like I can go and talk to a Gen AI chatbot and it helps me work through some things I'm kind of embarrassed to talk about. We also heard a lot about that it's used for sexual purposes, right? Like adolescents are interested in these things and they are asking chatbots and using AI to meet some of those needs. And also we heard some things about how it's used for deception. It's used to harass and humiliate and make fun of peers. It's also used to impersonate parents, impersonate adults in moments when adolescents need to work around systems. But they also talked about how it's incredibly important for creativity and joy and pleasure and fun, right? We see that 42% of of adolescents who use these platforms are doing it because they're bored and they want to play. So I do think it's important to remember like the playful aspect here and the joy and creativity that can come from using these platforms. So while we've been talking about a lot of the real challenges that these platforms present, like about democracy, it's also really a spot and a place for joy and creativity and development and learning. And I hope we get to talk about that too soon.
Yeah, I would love to. I guess I'm curious about your research. And so you've done sort of a lot of cross-cutting kind of issues, media, communities. Has anything related to the idea of play come up as something that is crucial to the well-being of kids in different arenas, whether it's media or chatbots or anything related to that?
The issue of play?
Yeah, the issue of play.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're seeing, right, is that for some of the reasons that have already been referenced, sort of gravitating to these technologies. I mean, I've always been intrigued by not only the sort of the adoption of these technologies by young people, understanding how that distributes across demographic features, for example. Always interesting nuances in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, age. You really begin to see these really important shifts, right, just within a 2 or 3, 4 year window, right, in terms of motivation for use and in terms of lived experience, in terms of what's most salient for them at this time in their lives. And so in some respects, right, thinking about just the environment and communities and world in which young people grow in, which we all understand, right, are not equal. And so, for instance, what we've come to understand over the years is in terms of why, for example, youth from lower income households, disproportionately, that might oftentimes mean, Black or Latino youth, why are they, quote unquote, sort of over-indexing, right, on these technologies, right? For the longest, we oftentimes thought that the digital divide meant that they didn't have access to, nor did they use these technologies, when in fact, the opposite was true, right? That they were using them, and actually using them more. And I think some of the things that you're showing and some of the research that you're doing, and certainly some things that we're tracking, is that we're sort of seeing some similar patterns with generative AI. And what happens, right, is so what happens, right, when young people have, less access to extracurricular activities, less access to, other kinds of structured opportunities to help them grow and develop, they oftentimes, right, left to their own devices, they end up sort of gravitating towards these technologies, right? Smartphones, tablets, social media, et cetera. And again, we know, right, what that oftentimes means, right? Exposure to a wide range of content, bullying content, misinformation, sexualized content, et cetera. And so if you think about that environment and think about kind of where play fits in, right, it'll be interesting to see, to what extent generative AI becomes a part of that environment, or is becoming a part of that environment, and what it means for what they're exposed to, what it means in terms of how they understand, navigate, and in some ways experiment, right, with the technology as well. So we shouldn't dismiss that. And what we've also come to understand is that, kids we oftentimes overlook when it comes to this space, oftentimes bring some of the most inventive, innovative applications of these technologies that in some ways end up transforming how these very technologies work. Think YouTube, think Instagram, think Twitter, now X, et cetera. But a lot of that, right, had to do with just the inventive ways in which the youth of color migrated to and began to experiment with and innovate with those technologies.
And this is exactly why we need to have young people involved in designing these tools, right? This is and this gets back to this idea of participatory design, right? I think your point is so important, right? We see this innovation, particularly among youth of color, but in children in general, who have these wonderful approaches, and we can learn from them, right? And that is in some ways we may get to the part of the conversation where we decide there are some things that certain children maybe shouldn't use at certain ages. And I think there is absolutely a need and a space for a developmental approach that designs tools for kids that meet them where they are in that particular developmental moment. But I think there's also a really incredibly important thing here, which is where we need to bring children into this conversation. We need to bring them into the design conversation. Actually, some of my colleagues at the Joan Gans Cooney Center are actually doing this with participatory design with young children and developing storytelling tools using generative AI, right? And having young people and children in the room designing, coming up with ideas, improving, playing with these tools to make them as really as functional and as good and enjoyable as possible so that we can harness this for learning and joy and play by going to the kids and making sure that it's meeting their needs.
You know, I was going to say something else that I've seen interesting in research that we've done, other research, data that's emerged. One of the most recent reports, Amanda, that you help Common Sense produces, you know, how our thinking about generative AI, for example, evolves or changes when we use it, right, when we get exposed to it. And what we're seeing, for example, is that, you know, those who are more likely to use it more frequently, tend to also have a different kind of perspective about its potential, about its future. They tend to feel less threatened. And I suspect, right, in part, right, because they're beginning to develop some degree of agency. And I think this is really important when we talk about children and kids, right, is that the conversation shouldn't always be about what AI is doing to them, but rather how we can help them to develop the skills to do interesting, innovative, and important sort of well-being things with AI. Mm-hmm. And I think that'll be really critical. And so as you think about, you know, what schools are doing or not doing, I think we all sort of followed, right, the initial reaction that schools had to ChatGPT. It was denial, it was rejection, it was shut them off. Within about less than a year or so, right, many began to pivot and begin to understand that was like the wrong-headed approach, and that in fact, right, we needed to bring these tools into the classroom, into the curriculum, to help young people develop these skills, to sort of work with these technologies in ways that sort of maintain their critical thinking, that develop that sense of literacy and agency. That's really important. And the only other thing I'll say here, right, is that, well, there are a lot of things to say, but I'm also intrigued by young people's sort of recognition of what's at stake for them, right, when it comes to these technologies. And in particular, a recognition that an over-reliance on AI in an educational setting, for example, to write that report or to do the research for you, that in some ways, right, is undermining some foundational skills that will be important to you. And this is something that they're actually talking about, right, in terms of what does it mean, right, to become over-reliant on these technologies? What does it mean for my ability to learn, for my ability to sort of act critically, to have some agency, right, in my pursuits? And they understand, right, that that's something that's at stake. I think that begins to start happening more around the middle to later stages of adolescence, but I think it's something that's important to note in terms of how they understand, right, what's critical here. Even with that in mind, right, sort of recognizing, right, that I don't think it's an option, right, to opt out of these technologies. I think we all understand that they will become more and more a part of the daily environment, more and more of a professional sort of occupational environment, which is why it's so important to expose and help them to develop the skills and the agency to navigate, to use, to create, and not simply to rely on or allow technologies to sort of automate all of their skills away from them. But these are things that they're thinking about. And you mentioned something, right, about this being sort of like, you know, maybe it was you who mentioned, right, you know, the first generation to sort of grow up where these tools are sort of easily accessible to us, and they will become just a part of the sort of normal fabric of everyday life. And I think that raises, right, some really interesting questions about part of the anxiety, right, and young people are already having these conversations internally and amongst themselves is, what will my future look like, right? Will I even have a job? Mm-hmm. And so if you think about, right, the sense of anxiety, the sense of stress, right, of all the other things that are going on, now you add this on, and it just sort of begins to sort of add even more dimension, even more weight to what they're having to grapple with. And these are questions that they're literally asking now, right? Will I have a job? And I think this idea of you know, how kids will begin to start making decisions about career path, about education, some things that you also noted in the report, they're already beginning to do this, and this will only accelerate, right, as this technology becomes more central, as it becomes more foundational, as it becomes more kind of integrated into the fabric of everything that we do. It will require them to sort of think about, right, what my future pathway is, what my relationship to the technology will be, what skills I need to develop, what does it mean to be educated and prepared for a world in which machines will essentially be able to do virtually everything that we have done historically, right, from a decision-making perspective, from an analytics perspective. I mean, it's a really interesting sort of challenge and environment that they're in, and they're beginning to sort of feel that pressure and some of that stress, and it'll just be interesting to see how we as a whole help them navigate that.
Yeah, it's funny. It makes me think of something my 14-year-old daughter said, which was, you know, the adults constantly switch. They said, you know, the screens are bad for you, but now we're going to put them all in schools, and that's what you'll use. You know, AI, we don't know, it's bad, you shouldn't use it, but now here, no, it's good now. You know, and I said, well, what does that equal? You know, social media is bad, but our schools are all going to have it, right? And we'll use it when it's okay, but you shouldn't use it. And so she had a lot of examples. And I said, well, what does that equal? And she says, apathy, which made me feel like I should have never taught her language, maybe. But no, it was a really good point, right? And I think if you spend time at, I don't know, middle schools, you see it, or high schools. So I do think there's a real risk of that too, right? Of creating this sense of powerlessness, which I think many kids, if you're around kids, you know, maybe 11 and up, to be charitable, there is a sense of, I mean, they've been inundated with messages about climate change and economy and political discourse, and from the time they were little. And so there is a real risk of us sort of crowding out the messages and making them not feel empowered with these tools. So I like the idea of participatory design and lots of ways of kind of getting them involved and still giving them a chance to say no. I don't think inevitability is ever inevitable.
Michelle, sorry, I just
please.
wanted to add, I think, because I spent a lot of time speaking to school districts in the US in particular, I think in general it's important that we don't think about, and you mentioned this, Craig, the presence or the use of AI in schools the way we do about cell phones. For example, we had the earlier panel around cell phones. AI, I get really annoyed when people say it's not going anywhere, and it, you know, whether it's AI or social media or phones or whatever. Yeah. But it really isn't. I feel like it's, and you mentioned this too, Craig, it's being forced upon us in a very powerful way. I feel like much more than social media was. So it really, it's not just that it's not going anywhere, it's that it's changing the fiber of our society, how we think about work, how we think about relationships, how we think about going to therapy. I have therapist friends who say their clients are starting to, again, process all their conversations in ChatGPT first, and they come to their next session and go, well, look at this is what ChatGPT said about what you told me during our
The new Dr. Google.
It's changing everything. Yeah. So I understand why schools initially had that reaction of just ban it. No, we don't know what to do with it. It's terrifying. But what I've found, I'm very lucky to be living in Hawaii, and there are a couple of schools there doing some really great work with AI and really incorporating it in really meaningful ways. You know, doing great work to revive Hawaiian traditional culture, language, storytelling, ancestry. I mean, it's the kind of stuff that actually brought tears to my eyes. It was the first time I felt hopeful about AI.
Great.
And I thought, if we just let Hawaiians control how AI works, it's going to be this is going to be amazing. So 2 years in a row, I've attended a conference there that was put on by one of the local schools called Kamehameha Schools. And one of the things they did for us was they brought four high school seniors to talk to us about how they use AI. And you could classify them as pretty heavy users based on what they were describing. But these were not the kinds of kids that you would maybe typically picture. You know, the young Gen Zers who are just living in this tech-saturated world. These kids were making tons of eye contact. They were very personable. They were very emotive. They were very social, and they were happy, and they were positive, and they were telling us about the different ways in which AI has kind of changed their lives in a really possible way. There was one girl there who has learning differences. She has ADHD. She was failing out of high school. And then a couple years before graduating, she started using ChatGPT to help her understand the content that was being presented to her in class, which she just couldn't take it in. She finished with a 4.0 GPA. She started her own business, and I think she finished like a first year of an associate's degree or something. That's like that. Like it just supercharged and superpowered all of their abilities to do the stuff they do the stuff they love to do. And I think what was really critical there was they were motivated by becoming better, learning more, being more successful, and they were in an educational setting that was supporting that, so that wasn't banning it, and that was really doing it in an intentional way. So AI policies, I think, they can be very vague to begin with, but that's one of the things when I speak to school districts that I really encourage them to do. Have some kind of rough sense of the types of tools that you're okay with, your teachers using, senior leaders, students, communicate this clearly to parents, and then really have your teachers talk to kids about this. If they have learning difficulties, look at how that can help. If they're practicing an oral exam, use ChatGPT to kind of to coach them and train them in doing that. If they need to use a different language and not English, use it for that. There are lots of different ways in which it can really be used in a beneficial and I feel like very hopeful.
Those are great
way.
points. And I know I have to interrupt because we need to give the audience time to ask questions of us. And we don't have too much time left. So if you have a question, you can send it through the QR code and it will show up here so I can ask it. Also, you can just go to the mic and ask it. And we have just a few minutes.
Just someone at the mic.
Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Josh Golan with Fair Play. Thanks for a great panel. I'm curious, Craig, you alluded to this a little bit, but I didn't hear a lot of conversation about the business model of generative AI, and I think if there's one thing we've learned from social media, it's that the business model and how platforms are designed are much more important than how users intend to use them, and in fact, we frequently undermine user autonomy, and that it's really easy to drive compulsive use. So I'm curious about that, and also on a panel on the risks of rewards, I didn't hear anything about the environment. The New York Times had a story yesterday about how communities in Georgia are going to have to start rationing water because of that water that's going to AI data centers. And when I think about the risks of an AI-mediated childhood, I think about kids not having any water in a few years.
I think those are great points. But
The business model question is really important, and there's so much to say about that. I mean, in terms of AI companions, right, it's still sort of early days. I mean, right now they're basically sort of competing against each other for market share, right, trying to get as many users as they possibly can. And they're in some ways, right, kind of replaying the playbook, the faulty playbook of social media, right? They sort of move fast, break things. It turns out they were breaking democracy, breaking communities, breaking health and well-being. And we know, right, that right now, right, in the pursuit of users, that they're not really taking into consideration, right, some of these principles around ethical design, some of these concerns around health and well-being. And so it's my sense, right, is that it's particularly right in terms of like you mentioned replica, character AI, some of these, companies who are really sort of staking, a claim in the sort of companion AI space. And a lot of the investment that's going into that technology is ramping up pretty significantly. And it appears as though investors feel very optimistic about what those products and technologies will likely generate, and hence they're pouring more and more money into it. But my point is, right, is that right now it's all about competition for users with little to no consideration, right, about impact on behavior, impact on mental health and well-being, impact on young people who we know are using these technologies, right, in a variety of ways, including, right, for their health and well-being. You mentioned, for example, part of what's making some of these technologies attractive, if we're just being honest, right, is the sort of sexualized content and experiences, right, that many users are able to encounter, young people in particular. And so the business model, I think, is going to become even more suspect once they begin to figure out how to monetize that attention. I mean, right now, I think they're still sort of early stage, just getting users. But at some point, right, the game will change, and it'll be how do we monetize this attention? How do we monetize this data? Basically, how do we exploit this sort of surveillance capitalism model that we saw with the early hints of social media?
And I think we also really need to make a distinction between some of these giant, large, general-purpose LLM models and some of the more purpose-built, smaller models, right? I do think for us in the future to create a space that's safer for children, for education, we have to have LLMs with like very tightly controlled training data sets which are cleaned, where we can eliminate as much as humanly possible the amount of bias and inaccuracy in what the models are going to generate. So I think moving forward, I think we do need to make a separation between the giant models, which right now I think are begging for regulation, to be totally honest, and some of the smaller models, which are sometimes built by people who I think have at least a little bit more attention at the very beginning of their developing of their products, that they care a little bit more about the children and the people who are going to use them. So I do think we're in a moment where we need to talk about the models differently, let alone the business models that underpin them.
So, Michelle, I was just very
Listen.
quickly, I was reading recently, I wanted to just read a quote to you all. I was reading, I read a lot of what the kind of tech CEOs say. It's a guilty pleasure. And so I was reading, the CEO of Anthropic wrote a blog a little while ago about how little they understand the technology that they've created, and which I find fascinating. So he said, if an ordinary software program does something, for example, a character in a video game says a line of dialogue, or my food delivery app allows me to tip my driver, it does those things because a human specifically programmed them in. Generative AI is not like that. When a generative AI system does something like summarize a financial document, we have no idea at a specific or precise level why it makes the choices it does, why it chooses certain words over others, or why it occasionally makes a mistake despite usually being accurate. So that's the CEO of one of the leading AI companies, and I think that connects, Josh, to what you're asking in terms of the business model, because the struggle is real for these companies. There's also the narrative of US versus China, and it's all being positioned in this way where, Google has made Gemini available to under 13-year-olds, which was one thing that particularly irked me when I found out that it happened, because it was delivered with this messaging of, you as a parent, who, by the way, probably doesn't even know what Gemini is, has never heard of it before, has never used it, you help your child use this in a responsible way. You have conversations with them. You tell them how AI sometimes makes mistakes. It's a completely unrealistic expectations. Parents are not equipped to do that. I know this as someone who works with parents a lot. They're not even done with figuring out social media, let alone something else.
It's exploiting that fear that parents have.
And
their
lack
kids
of
being left
awareness.
behind, and I want to say one thing about the business model. Part of it is, this technology is mostly held in like 4 companies, or and the game is global, right? And so getting users is important, but it's all about the training data. It's all about building these models and training the models. So users, but they're not seen as people.
Central to.
Yeah, it's really about the data, and it's really about training it to new and better levels, right? To produce new and better outputs. And so it's just worth remembering that the power dynamics between the different countries and between the players at the top who control all of this, that's it. That's the business model.
And just real quickly, one thing that we haven't mentioned, I'll just say it and won't get into it, but is agentic AI is here and it's coming, right? So what happens, right, when the AI has its own priorities, its own motivations, and what does that mean for young kids to be exposed to that environment?
Okay, let's move on. I think we have maybe time for one more question. Would that be all right? So let's go to the. Oh, I guess we should go to the site.
They were before me.
Yes. Hi. Go ahead.
Hey, my name is Jennifer Joy Madden from DurableHuman.com, and I just want to ask you about the value of foundational skills for children entering school, maybe K through 6, maintaining their ability to actually get a solid knowledge of how to read, how to do math, and that sort of thing, and whether that should be protected as AI is being invited into the schools. Just what your thoughts on that?
I was just quickly.
Yeah,
Oh, go
yes.
ahead.
Yes, it should be protected. I do think, and sorry, Teodora, get one more. I know we're almost out of time, but yeah, I think we have to do this. I think the challenge with the learning environment is we need to ensure that the AI isn't disrupting the acquisition of foundational skills. And so there are going to be moments when we are going to want to try to limit the use of AI that would disrupt those skills. And so that's, I think, the challenge that many teachers are experiencing, which is, when it is being used to create content and disrupting the ability to learn how to write a 5-paragraph essay, for example. And there are teachers in creative schools that are working around that, but that is, I think, a coming challenge.
I was just going to say that this is, again, some research done with adults, because that's mostly where we're at now. This was done by Microsoft and I think Carnegie Mellon, looking at knowledge workers, so adult knowledge workers, and kind of their patterns of use of ChatGPT, and suggesting a kind of an approach to using generative AI. They refer to it as being a confident steward of the technology, and there are certain requirements for you to be able to do that. So you need to still have the foundational knowledge. A lot of the research is showing that being somewhat of an expert, at least in the area, makes you a more powerful user of that technology. You have to know how to prompt. You have to know whether the outcome matches what your needs are. So I think all of that is, I think, good news for early education, elementary school education too, that awareness of, no, we still need to lay the foundation, that they still need to know some foundational things. Then you add on this incredibly powerful tool that can really, propel them and take them to all kinds of interesting, exciting places.
Can I just say, we were recently interviewing some clinicians who are using AI in clinical decision making in their practice. And one of the things they talked about was precisely this, right, is sort of medical education and training. When do you introduce generative AI into that pathway? And they thought that maybe after the first year or two, but they felt like from a foundation perspective, right, being able to diagnose, being able to do differential diagnosis, a range of things, competencies that they think are critical from a foundational perspective were important before they began integrating, right, AI and generative AI tools into the learning experience. So my sense is, right, that that's obviously not just unique to medical students, but even more so, right, for primary and secondary.
Okay, I'm very sad to say.
Can I say one other thing?
Have the final word, but make it
So,
quick.
so you're the first person who I ever heard say that they were lucky that they lived in Hawaii because of the schools. So
There's other reasons too, but I just, yeah.
I'm sure
The
there
schools
a lot
are
of
amazing.
reasons. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I know you were patiently waiting, but we'll still be here if you'd like to ask questions to us personally. Thank you so much for your attention and patience. We appreciate your questions, and I see that there's some great ones here, so happy to answer them if I can. But please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.